Once upon a time, in a peaceful village nestled by the green hills and sparkling rivers, there lived a young girl named Chinyere. Chinyere was known throughout the village for her beauty. Her skin shone like polished gold, and her hair was long and black, flowing like the river that ran through the village. She had a smile that could make anyone's day brighter, and she loved when people admired her. She was proud of her looks and made sure everyone noticed her, walking with her head held high, always the center of attention. Chinyere's best friend was Ngozi, who was also beautiful but with a mischievous streak. Ngozi liked to play tricks on people, and together she and Chinyere would laugh at the others in the village. One girl they loved to tease was Amara, a quiet and humble girl who came from a poor family. Amara didn't have much, but she had a heart of gold. She always helped others without asking for anything in return, but Chinyere and Ngozi saw her kindness as a weakness. One day the two girls decided to play a cruel prank on Amara. They spread a false rumor that the village teacher, Mr. Obi, had fallen in love with Amara and was going to marry her. Amara, who had always admired Mr. Obi for his kindness, was heartbroken when she overheard the gossip. She went to Mr. Obi asking if the rumors were true. Mr. Obi, who had never even thought of Amara that way, gently told her there was no truth to the rumors. But by then the whole village had heard the story and everyone laughed at Amara, calling her foolish. Chinyere and Ngozi watched from a distance, giggling as Amara ran off in tears. Chinyere felt a small pang of guilt, but she quickly pushed the thought away. "It's just a joke," she told herself. "Amara will get over it." Days went by and the incident faded from Chinyere's mind. But then something strange began to happen. A classmate named Chukwuemeka, who was known for his quiet nature, started looking at Chinyere in a way that made her feel special. Chukwuemeka was not like the other boys in the village who fawned over her. He didn't flatter her and he didn't try to win her attention. Instead, he was kind to her without asking for anything in return. Chinyere, who had always been the one in control, found herself drawn to him. One afternoon, Chukwuemeka invited Chinyere to a gathering that was being held at the village square. It wasn't a big event, just a small get-together of friends, but Chinyere was excited. She thought to herself, if Chukwuemeka is asking me, then maybe he really likes me. She spent the whole day preparing for the gathering, carefully picking out her finest clothes and fixing her hair just right. She wanted to look perfect to show everyone how beautiful she was. She was sure that Chukwuemeka would be impressed. But as the day of the event came closer, something strange happened to Chinyere. She woke up one morning to a horrible surprise. Her body smelled like fish. At first she thought it was a bad dream, but no matter how much she washed, the smell wouldn't go away. It clung to her like a heavy weight, making her feel embarrassed and disgusted. She tried to ignore it, covering herself with perfume, but the smell was still there, stronger than ever. When Chinyere arrived at the gathering, she noticed that people were staring at her, their faces scrunching up as the smell reached them. Chukwuemeka, who had once looked at her with admiration, turned his face away as if the smell was too much for him. Chinyere felt her heart sink into her stomach. It was as though the world around her was spinning, and she was falling deeper and deeper into a pit of shame. She tried to smile, but it felt forced. The other children whispered behind her back, and Chinyere felt the weight of their eyes on her. It was the first time in her life that she felt truly invisible, not because of her beauty, but because of something she couldn't control. The more she tried to hide the smell, the worse it became. Her body began to ache from the embarrassment, and she couldn't stay at the gathering any longer. With tears welling up in her eyes, Chinyere ran away. She didn't care where she was going, she just needed to escape the shame. As she ran through the village, the wind seemed to mock her, carrying the scent with her wherever she went. Her once beautiful face, which everyone had admired, was now filled with tears. Chinyer didn't understand what had happened. Why her? Why now? She was no longer the center of attention, and it hurt more than she could say. That night, as Chinyer lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the events of the day. She realized that her beauty, which she had always used to control others, no longer mattered. The smell of fish had stripped away the one thing she had always relied on. And for the first time she began to question everything she had ever known about herself. What had she done to deserve this? Chinyer walked into the classroom, heart racing. She was nervous, but there was something even more troubling than the usual anxiety. She could smell it again, the scent of fish. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger as she took her seat. Her classmates didn't seem to notice, but to her, it was like a heavy cloud hanging above her. For weeks now, the smell had been haunting her, following her wherever she went. She didn't know why, but every time she walked into the classroom, it was like the air grew thick with it. At first it was just whispers behind her back, then laughter, and soon enough her classmates avoided her completely. She had no idea what was going on. Nothing she did could make the smell go away. She washed her clothes, scrubbed herself with every soap she could find, and tried every perfume in the store, but it always returned. She thought maybe it was just a phase, but deep inside she couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. Today, though, something felt different. It felt like the room was holding its breath, as if everyone knew something was about to happen. Chinyer tried to ignore the growing discomfort in her chest and focused on the lesson. The teacher called on her to solve a math problem on the board, but as she stood up, a sudden wave of dizziness hit her. The classroom felt like it was spinning, and she reached for the blackboard to steady herself. Her fingers shook, her heart pounding in her chest. And then it happened. Her classmates' laughter stopped. She heard a few gasps, and when she looked down she saw it. Her legs, once firm beneath her, were now changing. Her skin began to shimmer and her body started to feel heavier. She tried to move, but it felt like her limbs were no longer in her control. Panic rose in her chest as she looked down at her feet, which were shrinking into fins. She cried out, but no sound came from her mouth. Her hands too were morphing into strange, soft fins. She wanted to scream, to ask for help, but she couldn't. The smell of fish was overwhelming now, and it felt as though the air had turned into water, swirling around her. Her classmates stared in horror, some of them backing away while others dropped their books in shock. But what hurt the most was seeing their eyes, their pity, their fear. The teasing, the whispering, she had caused it all. As her body twisted and turned, she could feel it. Her form was no longer human. She was growing larger, bigger, and her once delicate arms had turned into fins. Her body had become a massive fish, now taking up space in the classroom. She thrashed in panic, her new tail splashing against the desks, the room suddenly feeling so small. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they didn't fall. Instead, they turned into tiny droplets that sank into the sea of despair inside her. She cried out again, but only a soft, gurgling sound came from her throat. She was drowning in her own helplessness. And then, as if the very air was thick with magic, a shadow appeared at the door. It was Amara. Chinyer's heart sank as she recognized the girl who had been nothing but kind to her, despite everything Chinyer had done to her. Amara stood in the doorway, her face calm and unshaken, her eyes not filled with anger but something much deeper. Chinyer tried to speak, but all that escaped her was a weak, bubbling sound. Amara stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Chinyer. "This is what you get," Amara said softly, her voice clear despite the chaos around them. This is what happens when you treat people like they don't matter. When you make them feel small, when you humiliate them, when you think you're better than them. I warned you, Chinyer. Chinyer felt a chill run through her. Was this really happening? Her mind raced as she tried to understand what was happening to her. Why had Amara cursed her? Why had it come to this? Amara's gaze softened for just a moment before she spoke again. I didn't want this for you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But you pushed me too far. You hurt me, Chinyer. And now you'll know what it feels like to be helpless. With that, Amara turned and began to walk toward the door. Her presence, once a source of light, now felt like a shadow over Chinyer's entire world. And just before she left the room she said, "Goodbye, Chinyer. May you learn what true humility is." As Amara disappeared from the classroom, Chinyer's heart broke. She wanted to shout, to beg her for forgiveness, but the fishy gurgle in her throat was all she could muster. Her classmates were still staring, but it didn't matter anymore. The world had turned cold and distant. Chinyer was no longer human. She was just a fish, big, helpless, and trapped in the classroom, surrounded by her classmates' stares and the scent of the sea. The curse had taken hold and there was nothing she could do to reverse it. And so she sat there, crying silently in her fish form, unable to do anything but regret every moment she had ever spent making others feel small. Her journey, now one of silence and reflection, had just begun. The room was filled with screams. Chinyer could feel the fear and panic radiating from her classmates as they backed away, eyes wide with terror. Some of them ran out of the classroom, their footsteps echoing down the hall. Others stood frozen in place, their mouths open in disbelief. Chinyer, now a large fish in the middle of the classroom, felt the weight of their fear and it made her heart ache. She didn't know how long she stayed there. Time seemed to stretch on forever as she remained in her fish form, helpless, struggling against the water that filled her lungs. She wanted to call out for help, but all that escaped her mouth was a soft gurgle. The once familiar world around her felt foreign and frightening. Then the door creaked open again. It wasn't one of her classmates. It was the school principal who had hurriedly called for help. Behind him was an older man wearing a suit and carrying a Bible. He was the pastor. The principal stepped inside, his eyes wide with surprise as he took in the sight of the classroom filled with desks and a giant fish where Chinyer used to sit. "Father, please help us," the principal said, his voice trembling. This is beyond anything we can handle." The pastor stepped forward, unfazed by the strange scene before him. He had seen his share of miracles and curses in his time, and he knew what needed to be done. He held the Bible high and the room fell silent. The pastor began to pray, his voice calm but powerful as he spoke words of healing and restoration. Chinyer's heart thudded as she listened to the prayer, and she closed her eyes, hoping that anything would work. The words flowed over her like a cool breeze, bringing some peace amidst the chaos. As the pastor prayed, Chinyer's mind flashed back to everything, her actions, the way she had treated Amara, how she had humiliated her. She thought about the pain she had caused and wished she could take it all back. A deep sorrow filled her and she cried, more tears flowing from her fish eyes than ever before. And then suddenly Chinyer felt something strange. A warmth spread from deep inside her, and for the first time since the curse had started she felt light. The heaviness that had gripped her heart began to lift. Slowly she could feel her body changing. With one final powerful prayer, the pastor reached out his hand toward Chinyer, and in that moment her body began to shift. Her fins shrank, her tail disappeared, and her body returned to its original human form. She was no longer a fish. Chinyeol gasped, taking in a deep breath as she found herself sitting on the classroom floor, fully restored. She was human again. Her parents, who had arrived late, rushed into the room as soon as they saw the miracle unfold. Her mother, with tears in her eyes, knelt down beside her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "My daughter, you're back," her mother whispered, her voice filled with relief. Chinyeol clung to her, still in shock from everything that had happened. The principal and the pastor stood nearby, offering quiet words of reassurance. "What happened?" her father asked, looking between her and the pastor. "How did this curse happen?" The pastor, who had finished his prayer, simply shook his head. "I don't know the details, but I believe this is a lesson for Chinyeol. She must reflect on her actions and learn the value of kindness and humility." The room was still and heavy with the weight of the moment, but a quiet peace had settled over it. Chinyeol, though shaken, understood. She knew that what had happened to her was not just a curse, it was a chance for her to learn, to grow. And as for Amara, the girl who had cursed her, she was never seen again. No one knew where she had gone, and no one ever spoke of her again. It was as if she had vanished into the wind, leaving behind only the memory of her words. Chinyeol had been given a second chance, a chance to change, to become the person she had always been capable of being. And from that day on, she promised herself that she would never treat anyone the way she had treated Amara. Her journey had been one of humility and understanding, and she was ready to live it with a heart full of gratitude and kindness. As Chinyeol walked out of the classroom with her parents, she looked back one last time, silently thanking the pastor and everyone who had helped her. She had learned her lesson, and she would never forget the price of her actions. The moral lesson of the story is that kindness and humility are powerful, and treating others with respect is always the right choice. Sometimes, we must face the consequences of our actions to learn valuable lessons. Thank you for watching, and remember to always choose kindness in all that you do.